Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. If you watch my channel, you probably agree with me that something very special is happening right now as we transition from President Nelson to President Oaks. We've already noted so many interesting things about both of them, especially President Nelson, because he was our last president of the church, and he was very focused on the second coming. But these two came together as a pair into the apostleship, and I'm not going to rehash everything that we've talked about. It's basically all we've been talking about ever since President Nelson passed away, because there's so much to consider. Well, I just found something new, and this blew me away once I had this realization. It has to do with Joseph Smith's Jubilees. Now, if you're new to the channel, you probably don't know what this is. I didn't find out about it until, I think, last year. I'd never heard about this before. But there were these special years that Joseph Smith called Jubilees. And I'm going to show you where it comes from. I'm not just making this up. Before we get into that, if you're interested in this type of thing, Jubilees and special dates and stuff like that, I would recommend my friend Jen with Christian Fire Poppy. We think a lot alike. She really likes to talk about timing and Jewish feast days and Jubilees and stuff like that. So I'll put a link for her channel in the description box below. She's really good. But, okay, so I have a spreadsheet called Timeline Jubilees. There are different types of Jubilees. I'm not going to go over all of them in this video, but you can access my spreadsheet anytime. The link is in the description box of each video. The concept of the Jubilee comes from the Bible. Specifically, let's go to quotes A through Z. And if you go to Leviticus chapter 5, verses 1 through 22, this is where we get the concept of Jubilee years. And what it was is every 50 years would be a Jubilee year. You'd have essentially 7-year periods, and each 7-year period was like a day of the week. So like a week. So you have 7 weeks, and then and then on that 50th day, so basically 49 days, and then on the 50th day of years would be a Jubilee year. And it's similar to first fruits and Pentecost, and otherwise known as the Feast of Weeks. For that, each year you would have the first offering of barley at the temple, and then you would count 49 days, or you'd count 50 days. And the 50th day is Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. So, you have this idea of like 49 and then 50. That's typically what we're talking about with Jubilees, only it's in years. Well, in the early history of the church, you have this quote from Joseph Smith. You can find this on the Joseph Smith Papers website, Journal 1835 to 1836. So this is at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Joseph Smith says, "Savior made his appearance to some, while angels ministered unto others, and it was a Pentecost and endowment indeed, long to be remembered, for the sound shall go forth from this place into all the world, and the occurrences of this day shall be handed down upon the pages of sacred history to all generations, as the day of Pentecost. So shall this day be numbered and celebrated as a year of Jubilee, in time of rejoicing to the saints of the Most High God." Okay, so we know with the restoration, there's a lot of things that have come back that haven't been practiced for some time, or that got corrupted. We're in the last dispensation, and not everything looks the way it did, back from biblical times, because we have modern day revelation and things progress over time. And so you have this introduction of a Jubilee year in this dispensation. Well, if we go to 1843, we've got this. This is also from Joseph Smith Papers, Journal, December 1842 to June 1844. So this is the Nauvoo period. Joseph Smith says, Thursday, April 6th, 1843, the first day of the Jubilee. Okay, so 50 years have not passed. In the Old Testament, it's every 50 years. In this case, it's 7 years after 1836, the year that the Curtain Temple was dedicated. And what's interesting is that the church was established in 1830. So 7 years later was 1836. 7 years after that, 1843. So it appears that the Jubilee, and I don't know if you would want to say the Jubilee from the Old Testament, but this kind of Jubilee cycle in this dispensation with what he's doing here is every 7 years. Okay. So the first day of the Jubilee of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a special conference assembled on the platform of the temple or rough floor of the basement at 10 o'clock a.m. And then in the footnote, this footnote 119 on the Joseph Smith Papers website, it says, the anniversary of the organization of the church on the 6th of April, 1830, Wilford Woodruff noted that the term Jubilee was used because this anniversary marked the, quote, commencement of the 14th year of the church, end quote. An apparent reference to an adaptation of the 7-year sabbatical cycle outlined in the Old Testament. So in Hebrew, they call it a Shemitah. So every 7 years is like a Sabbath. That's why I have the days of the week right here. So in Judaism, the Saturday or Sabbath of years is a sabbatical year. Happens every 7 years. And the Jubilee is actually like a second Sabbath year. So you have two Sabbath years in a row. Okay, so there's some kind of adaptation of the sabbatical cycle. He's calling them Jubilees. They happen every 7 years. You also have this you can find this on the Wilford Woodruff Papers website. Just because of this first part, I want to go to the website so you can see it for yourself. This is how it's written in his journal. April 6th, Jubilee, 1843, April 6, 1843. The Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints met at the Temple of the Lord at Nauvoo at 10 o'clock a.m. It held Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 3 days. It is the commencement of the 14th year of the church, which makes it the commencement of the Jubilee. We had an interesting time through the conference. And then here's the scan of the journal right here. So as far as I know, there's no other mention anywhere of this Jubilee cycle. If you know of any, please send it my way, but I've not come across any other mention of this observance of Jubilees every 7 years. In 1880, the church had a Jubilee in the sense that it was a 50-year anniversary. You can pause and read this if you want. They had like an actual Jubilee where debts were forgiven, and all sorts of stuff happened in that year that was more like the Old Testament. But I was curious when I found this out, what does it look like as you go forward in time? If this is a thing that continues, I mean, it doesn't seem like it publicly continues, but maybe it is a thing that, the leadership of the church is aware of, or maybe the Lord continues to view these 7-year periods or every 7 years as like special. So what are the dates of our time? When was the last Jubilee? When's the next one? Well, it turns out, if we fast forward, oh, by the way, I just want to highlight this. On the 21st Joseph Smith Jubilee, it was in 1976, or in other words, the bicentennial of the United States. I don't think that that's coincidence. But if you fast forward to our own time, it turns out that President Nelson became president of the church in 2018. In 2018 is when the 27th Joseph Smith Jubilee started. Now, I will note that President Nelson became president of the church on January 14th of that year. And if the Jubilee is supposed to start on April 6th because it's the anniversary of the founding of the church, then he became president of the church in the same calendar year as the Jubilee. But if you go from April 6th to April 6th, he became president of the church just before the Jubilee started, but in the same calendar year. But it's interesting because, you fast forward to 2025, and this year is the 28th Joseph Smith Jubilee. And we all know that President Oaks became president of the church this year. And it's actually during the Jubilee period from April 6th of 2025 to April 6th of 2026. I wanted to know, are there any other presidents of the church that became president of the church during a Jubilee year? So I consulted this Wikipedia article just to quickly get the dates right here of their ordination. And I have this column hidden, so let's go ahead and unhide that. And we have President Oaks. He became president of the church during a Jubilee. President Nelson became president of the church in the same calendar year as when a Jubilee started. But when you go back in time, there is no other president of the church that becomes president of the church during a Jubilee year. None of them. None of them. The only two is President Nelson. And like I said, President Nelson wasn't necessarily during the Jubilee period, but the same calendar year. And then President Oaks during the Jubilee period. So technically, he's the only one. He's the only one. It's also interesting that President Nelson's first year was during the 27th Joseph Smith Jubilee. President Nelson was the 17th president of the church. He also passed away on the 27th of September of this year. And President Oaks is the 18th president of the church and he started during the 28th Joseph Smith Jubilee. And I also want to point out, even though it's not necessarily the topic of this video, you had the 2017 Great American Eclipse just a few months before President Nelson became president of the church, and the year before he became president of the church. And then the next one happened about 7 years later, in the year before President Oaks became president of the church. So there's just, in my mind, there's just too much. There's too much that points to the fact that there's something very special happening between these two presidents of the church. There is so much. There's so much. But on top of everything that we've already talked about, you can add this to the list: the Joseph Smith Jubilees. Again, I'm not saying that this is still a thing that the church observes or practices. I don't know that anything was necessarily practiced the first two times, other than the fact that it was declared a Jubilee year. But I wouldn't be surprised if maybe it is thought about or observed in some kind of way, whether among church leadership or even just on the other side of the veil, or with the Lord or whoever. There's a reason why Joseph Smith talked about this and did it 2 times. One at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and then the second time at the Nauvoo Temple. Gosh, where am I? Right here. The first time, 1836. The second time, 1843. It's interesting because in this case, it was March 27th when the Kirtland Temple was dedicated. So it was not yet April 6th, but the Jubilee year was starting then. But then the next time they did it on April 6th because it's supposed to be the anniversary of the church. So, March 7th is pretty close to April 6th. So in that year, I think it's under special circumstances because this was the first temple of this dispensation. That's probably why it started on that day in that year. I feel like I've already searched to see if there were any other times that this was mentioned, like on the Joseph Smith papers. Well, it wouldn't be there because he was martyred shortly before the next Jubilee. He did not make it to the third Joseph Smith Jubilee in 1850. I seem to remember searching the Wilford Woodruff papers website, and I didn't find anything there. So if you know of any other mention of these 7-year Jubilees, please send it my way because I need to add it to this spreadsheet, and it may give us further insight. But it just turns out, it just so happens that no other president of the church became president of the church during a Jubilee year other than President Oaks. And then President Nelson, it was during the same calendar year that the Jubilee started. I feel like that's just so unlikely. Jubilees, eclipses, other things. The hand of the Lord is in this. And I tend to think that it has to do with the second coming. I'll explain why. This will be the last thing that we talk about in this video. Let's go to my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. This is currently row 312 for Jubilee. I want to read what it says in the Old Testament student manual for Leviticus 25. The sabbatical in Jubilee year. Many today look upon the law of Moses as a primitive, lesser law designed for a spiritually illiterate and immature people. This chapter illustrates the commitment of faith and trust in God that was required of one who truly followed the law. The Israelite was told that once in every 7 years he was to trust wholly in God rather than in the fruits of his own labor for sustenance. The land, too, was to have its Sabbath rest. Think about the millennium, you guys, how it's a time of peace. Things are going to calm down. It's the 7th 1,000-year period, and that follows the pattern of the creation, how the 7th day was the day that the Lord rested. Okay, so the land, too, was to have its Sabbath rest, and no plowing, sowing, reaping, or harvesting was to take place. Further, once each 50 years, the land would have a double rest. The 7th sabbatical year, the 49th year, was to be followed by a Jubilee year. So 49 and 50, a double rest. God had delivered Israel from bondage of Egypt, forgiven their numerous debts to him, and given them an inheritance in the land of promise. Let me just pause right there. I've talked a lot on this channel how it feels like that story is a foreshadowing of our own time. You have Israel that wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then finally they were able to enter into the promised land, which I think is a foreshadowing of us moving into the millennium and inheriting the earth. After going through this dispensation of trial, being tried as a people, being shaped and turned into a Zion people that are ready to inherit the earth and receive the Lord when he comes. Okay, to demonstrate their love of God and fellow men, Israel was to follow that example during the Jubilee year. Slaves or servants were to be freed and the land returned to its original owner and debts forgiven. To me, that sounds a lot like the millennium. There's going to be some pretty radical changes. It's not going to be business as usual as it has been for the last 6,000 years. Okay, continuing. Modern followers of the higher gospel law would do well to assess their own commitment to God and their own love of neighbor by asking themselves if they could live such a law. Is their faith sufficient to trust in the Lord for 3 years' sustenance, as was asked of Israel? One Bible scholar suggested two important ideas symbolized in the requirements of the Jubilee year. Quote, the Jubilee seems to have been typical, one, of the great time of release, the gospel dispensation, when all who believe in Christ Jesus are redeemed from the bondage of sin, repossess the favor and image of God, the only inheritance of the human soul, having all debts canceled and the right of inheritance restored. To this, the prophet Isaiah seems to allude, and particularly allude Isaiah 26:13, and particularly chapter 61, verses 1 through 3. Number two, of the great resurrection. And we all know that that's going to be one of the primary features of the second coming in the millennium, the resurrection of the dead, starting with the morning of the first resurrection. So number two, of the general resurrection. It is, says Mr. Parkhurst, a lively prefiguration of the grand consummation of time, which will be introduced in like manner by the trump of God. 1 Corinthians 15:52. When the children and heirs of God shall be delivered from all their forfeitures and restored to the eternal inheritance allotted to them by their Father, and thenceforth rest from their labors and be supported in life and happiness by what the field of God shall supply. And I'm just going to end it right there. So, we've talked about the possibility of the story of Moses and Joshua being a foreshadowing of President Nelson and President Oaks. President Nelson being the Moses figure who lived to a relatively old age, led Israel. We know that President Nelson was all about gathering scattered Israel, which he could not do without the priesthood key that Moses restored in the Kirtland Temple. President Nelson really used that key. It seems that he may, if this all turns out to be correct, he may have led the church up to the millennium, but did not enter the millennium himself in mortality. And that President Oaks, potentially the Joshua figure, is going to be the one that leads us across the Jordan River and into the millennium. We'll just have to wait and see. But again, this whole Jubilee thing and what Jubilees potentially symbolized in the Old Testament, how there's kind of like a second coming and millennial theme to them. I don't know. All I can say is President Oaks is the only one that became president of the church during a Joseph Smith Jubilee year. Does it mean anything? Only time will tell. Okay, but that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.